Now you might think, hang on, didn't you do Altered Beast before? And yeah, I did, quite a while ago. I would be happy with that, but well, for some reason a lot of my older vids are unlistenable because YouTube screwed their audio up. It's for this reason that I'd actually like to and will redo a bunch of them because, well, that just can't stand. And I don't know, something as important as Altered Beast perhaps deserves a bit more than a 5-minute video filled with corny jokes. It needs more. So don't worry, what you're going to get today is the full Altered Beast experience. We're certainly not going to be just sticking with the Mega Drive, that's for sure. Nor are we going to be sticking with just the original game. But obviously that's a good starting point. Now, Altered Beast's origin story isn't super special, just another arcade game made by Team SHINOBI, also known as Sega AM1 and headed up by Makoto Uchida. If you're not too familiar, then you should know that AM1 were one of Sega's premier arcade teams alongside the arguably more famous AM2 division, responsible for many arcade classics of their own, including, as you might have guessed, the original Shinobi. In this generation, they'd also make other classics like Golden Axe, Alien Syndrome, Thunderblade and one of their very first titles, 1986's Fantasy Zone. The team is still at the head of Sega's arcade concerns today, and Uchida has remained as the division's boss since its formation. In an interview with the French website Joypad, Uchida indicated that Altered Beast was originally designed to be more complex than it eventually ended up being. Each enemy would have their own strengths and weaknesses, and the player would have to figure out what worked in order to win. Presumably a few more moves would have been available to the player. However, the concept was cut before it could be implemented into the game, which apparently did away with half of the game's animations. Ultimately though, Uchida preferred Altered Beast as it eventually came out, as a more streamlined and fun experience. The Altered Beast that we all know is simply a side-scrolling beat-em-up, with one little twist. You walk right and you kill baddies, usually with one or, at the most, 2 hits. A popular style of arcade game, seen in contemporaries like Data East's Bad Dudes and Taito's The Ninja Warriors, but traceable all the way back to IREM's Kung Fu Master. Simple, coin-eating fun, and while there's no great shakes in the gameplay, it's easy to get a kick out of it. Altered Beast differs from the previous games firstly through presentation. It is undeniably a lot better looking than most games of this type were, and filled with the sort of graphics and visual effects that Sega were known for in the arcades. Everything is relentlessly smooth and there's a whole lot of scaling, all that good stuff. And of course there's the transformation. Every time our hero kicks the heads off a white Cerberus, he can get an orb which boosts his muscles. 3 of those and he transforms into a beast, capable of attacks that lay waste to all normal enemies. It is essential to be in the beast form in order to face the end of level boss. If you fail to transform by the 3rd time you meet him, the level will loop back to the beginning. Honestly though, even though the game is quite frustrating and difficult, you kinda have to purposefully work at not transforming in order to do that. Generally you'll be transformed by the 2nd time you meet Neff, and if you play regularly you could easily be transformed by the 1st time. The plot is, well, not much. The aforementioned Neff is an evildoer from the ancient Greek underworld, and he has captured Zeus's daughter Athena. Zeus resurrects an unnamed centurion, promising him freedom if he rescues Athena, who Neff seemingly wants to change into a bird. Personally, I think he'd be better off just getting a pet already. Cue 5 stages of combat in the land of the Odyssey, battling various monsters before defeating Neff in the very pits of Hades. In true Sega style, the end credits reveal that the whole thing was actually a film, and everybody has a beer at the wrap party. The game itself is also, in all honesty, not much, especially not these days. But it was quite impressive back then, and good to see a lot of Sega's parlour tricks transferred into a genre that wasn't racing or a space shooter. The size of the bosses, turning enemies into stone, the kick-ass beast attacks and the transformations themselves, along with some really good music, mean that there is a lot of good stuff to appreciate in places. However, it does get a little monotonous. It does move quite slowly for a side-scrolling beat-em-up, and it does tend to feature a bit too much waiting around at points, waiting for a Cerberus to get into position, waiting to attack zombies, hell, just waiting for the level to catch up with you. There's a big auto-scroller element to Altered Beast that in the end doesn't really work, and if you don't get through a level quickly, they can get old pretty sharpish. The problem with that, however, is that obviously the game is at its best when you're playing as the beasts, and it's not super satisfying if you're not spending all that much time as the beasts. When you're just playing as the human, it's just a rather annoying side-scroller where you have shit attacks. Now those beasts are worth going through a little, as they do certainly change things up from the regular punch-kick formula. The first stage is a werewolf, who can use a fireball and dash across the screen, which is most satisfying although enjoyably risky against the first stage's boss. The second stage is a rare dragon, which is quite cool as he can fly. The second stage is probably my favourite as a whole, with lots of fun enemies, a moody background, and that boss with all the eyes. Mind you, if you know where to go, then the were dragon can electrocute the second level boss in literally seconds. Now the third stage has my obvious favourite beast, the were bear, affectionately known to me as Kung Fu Bear. He can turn enemies into stone and do a cannonball roll, and he just looks great. He reminds me more of a Victorian era boxer these days, mind you. The fourth stage is kind of lousy for me. The were tiger has a fireball and can do a vertical dash, but it's the least impressive stage with by far the worst boss, and honestly the least useful of the beasts. The fifth stage is disappointing too. A good background and lots of tough enemies, but the beast itself is a golden werewolf palette swap, and Neff himself can be easily cheesed with flying dash attacks. They're great designs, one and all, although it is a shame that occasionally they're not used to their best. The actual transformations themselves though, will never stop being awesome. I do still find a lot to enjoy about Altered Beast in spite of its simplicity and its many flaws, and it's still a game that I'll happily fire up every now and again. I mean, it's so short after all, no more than 20 minutes long, and filled with nostalgia, famous moments, and things that you could recognise from other Sega games, like the cockatrices in Stage 2 that later appeared as rideable beasts called chicken legs in Golden Axe. The music, as in most Sega titles of the era, is stunning. There's nothing like the kick into powered up after the transformation, and the rest of the soundtrack is suitably doomy. While the gameplay certainly has its bad spots, the game does manage to make up for it with sheer spectacle at times. In the end, it's not the best Sega arcade game, and not helped by immediately preceding the much better and more impressive Golden Axe, but it certainly isn't bad. And, being a side-scroller, it was always going to be a good candidate for a home release. There are lots of conversions of this game, and we'll get to them, but obviously the first and most important one is the Mega Drive version, picked as the key title that would impress people and demonstrate the console's arcade capabilities. It had been a long time since we'd seen a machine that was capable of accurate conversions of an arcade game. You'd have to go back to the NES's early days for something like that. Since then, most arcade ports to the home were usually heavily compromised or just different games entirely. It was hoped that Altered Beast would sell the Mega Drive in the same way that Donkey Kong sold the Famicom. And so what you get is a pretty accurate conversion of the original. Almost too accurate, in fact. Very little has changed here, despite the graphics naturally taking a slight hit. The arcade scalar antics are largely gone, and obviously there's not as much colour, but the Mega Drive version does have a lot of parallax scrolling going on, which the arcade game didn't have. It's certainly 16-bit quality, and all the enemies are present and correct, as are all the levels, all the voice samples, all the cutscenes and all the transformations. The important parts that sold the game originally have not been touched. There are slight tweaks to enemy positioning and balancing that make the game easier than the arcade version, but little more than that. The only other big change I can think of is that if you somehow end up in human form by the third time you meet Neff, then you'll actually have to fight the boss as a human. The trouble with this is that while it is a very good conversion, in the end it's still the same not all that great arcade game, only without the added aura and presence that an arcade machine provides. Altered Beast really struggles to make an impression in the home. However, one other thing should be noted about this port: the immediacy of it. Altered Beast was released to the arcades in August of 1988. It was released in Japan for the Mega Drive in November of the same year. Yep, just 3 months. It was rare, if not unheard of, for an arcade game to be found in the home that quick, especially not an arcade game that would have been considered as current as Altered Beast was. It's quite likely that the whole thing was by design. Altered Beast was always destined to be a Mega Drive game, but would be hyped with an arcade release first, thus hyping the Mega Drive even more. It makes sense seeing as Sega were looking for anything that could possibly give them a foothold in the Japanese console market, although alas this didn't work. It also gives us an answer as to why the Mega Drive port is virtually identical to the arcade in every way. With such a short timescale, it's not like there'd have been much time to actually do anything except a straight conversion. Uchida himself had only a slight role in the conversion, although apparently it was a nightmare, which suggests that the whole thing was yet another massive trademark video game death crunch. The conversion itself was coordinated by the mysterious No Nukes, whose real name is unknown, but Reiko Kodama of Phantasy Star fame worked on the project as a designer. It's technically impressive, but yeah, it does all come back to the original game itself being average. In retrospect, Altered Beast on the Mega Drive could have certainly benefited from a bit more time in development, perhaps allowing for some extra bits, or even a reintroduction of these strengths and weaknesses mechanic. It could have been a better console game. The changes in balance do make it a bit more fun to play than the arcade game, however, and being able to continue with A and Start makes it even less annoying. Generally, if I'm going to play Altered Beast, I'll play this instead of the arcade version. It's certainly fun enough, but it's not exactly a game that inspires repeated plays in the same way that, say, a Donkey Kong would. Perhaps Sega realised this and made sure that most of their later arcade conversions were accurate but also notably different and absolutely worth playing on the system. Golden Axe is a good example of Sega unquestionably getting it right, adding more stuff but still retaining the arcade's brevity. Still, I dig Altered Beast a lot, in spite of all of its faults. A lot of people really dislike it, but for me, geez, it wouldn't even belong in a top 100 of the Mega Drive's worst games, let alone 20. It also did a respectable enough job as the system's pack-in title. It's not exactly something you'd be willing to pay for separately, but it does okay as a basic introduction to the Mega Drive and what it can do. At least it did before Sonic came along. Anyway, as mentioned, there are a lot of conversions of Altered Beast that are a bit less important than the Mega Drive one. Here's some of the highlights. A few people may well know the Master System version, which is basically an even more stripped down version of the MD version. Nice to see it on here, but that's about it. The game just plays so slowly, almost to the point of it being unplayable. It's really not a good version of the game, to say the least. Cruelly, this was also the one I had growing up instead of the Mega Drive version. Ugh, what pain. The Famicom version is a weird one. Produced by AMIGA, it's obviously worth wondering how on earth Altered Beast even ended up on the Famicom, being a Sega title and all. Unlike some of the Sega games that ended up on the Famicom and even the NES like Fantasy Zone and Shinobi, which arrived courtesy of Tengen and were unlicensed, this title was officially licensed by both Sega and Nintendo. So yeah, who knows what the motivation was here. The NES Altered Beast suffers from terrible graphics, but it moves a lot smoother than the Master System game. It's also the only conversion of Altered Beast that isn't a straight port, featuring a couple of new levels with new beasts in order to make up for stuff that had to be left out. It's not great or even good, and it's incredibly difficult, but I honestly prefer it to the straight and better looking but awful Master System version. But what about the other console of the time? Well, yeah, the PC Engine got some Altered Beast, although only in Japan. And alas, it's a bit disappointing. It looks and moves fine, but the controls are just broken, everything's really slow, there's a huge delay on the jump, and it just feels nasty as hell. There's a CD version too, which even comes with a story cutscene, as well as all the speech samples that aren't on the Who card. But the gameplay is virtually identical, there's no Red Book audio, and it's only one player. Sadly, Altered Beast stinks on the PC engine. It's better than the Master System version, but that's about it. The computers got their fair share of Altered Beast too, and I couldn't not cover them. The Spectrum version, published by Activision, is actually interesting. For the specky, it looks amazing. You get the full arcade attract mode and everything. There's even a proper ending and the arcade sense of scale to boot. A lot of colours and, honestly, an acceptable amount of colour clash. A lot of enemies and other things removed, and every stage now suddenly takes place at night, but that's not a surprise. There's also cracking AY versions of the game's songs that play throughout, and even in 128K, it wasn't always common for a Spectrum game to have in-game music, let alone more than one track. However, the upshot of all this is that the game moves very slowly indeed, there's no invincibility frames, meaning that you lose lives in a second, and the controls are awful, requiring you to press back and fire to punch, and forward and fire to kick instead of, you know, just fire. Still, it's surprising just how much the developers managed to include on the humble specky. Awesome to look at, considerably less so to actually play. The Spectrum's surprising showing gives you hope for the C64 version, but alas it doesn't really live up to it. The controls are better, this game actually has the sense to not have you press a direction to punch, which is good, and it certainly moves a bit smoother, but it all does look a bit naff. And there's no music, which is just a shocker. It has music in the intro, but nothing in game, and I can't honestly think why. Surely the C64 could handle it if the Spectrum could. It's hard to overstate just how much not having any music completely takes away from everything. This is a game that really does rely on its presentation, and so it does spoil what could have been, despite rather lousy graphics, an OK computer version. It is certainly a fuck of a lot better to play than the specky one though. So of course, if you want a decent computer version of Altered Beast, the AMIGA is the best you're gonna get. It's got OK enough controls, it's got good music, and a lot less is taken out of this version than either the specky or the C64. Some things about it are annoying, it can be a bit tricky sometimes to figure out how to do both beast attacks, but generally it plays just fine. Of course it's not well liked, cause this is what is known in the AMIGA world as an Atari ST port, meaning just that and usually scorned by AMIGA fans for being an Atari ST port, because after all the Atari ST is obviously inferior. It should also be noted, for completeness, that there's an AMSTRAD version that has a bit more colour, but basically plays exactly like the Spectrum version in all respects, and an MSX version that's an exact port of the Spectrum version. So now you know. And with that, well, Altered Beast basically went into hibernation. It had served its purpose and no one was exactly clamouring for a sequel. Arcade tastes changed, abandoning these side-scrolling games in favour of proper beat-em-ups and fighters, and well, it's not like Altered Beast was ever amongst Sega's most favoured titles in any case. It served a purpose as the pack-in title for the Mega Drive for a couple of years, but was then immediately replaced by Sonic on its arrival in 1991. By the mid to late 90s, the game was virtually a half-remembered obscurity, and there weren't exactly any calls for it to be revived. Only Matthew Sweet, clearly the game's biggest fan, flew the flag for it. However, it did return. Sort of. The now deceased THQ got the rights to make games for some old Sega IPs in the early 2000s, and one of the games that they'd publish was Altered Beast Guardian of the Realms for the Game Boy Advance, developed by the also now deceased 3D6 Games and released in 2002. So yeah, I'm sure it's really good. Now the thing with a lot of these updated games is that they're usually changed drastically and bashed into nothingness by people who don't know a whole lot about the original game. Well, don't worry, 3D6 clearly loved Altered Beast, that's for sure. Unfortunately, they loved it so much that the game is basically way more Altered Beast than you can possibly take. It's certainly faithful gameplay wise, that's for sure. The only real addition is other power-ups, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's all the moves, all the signature speech samples are recreated, and it's all ancient Greek mythos, only now the undead soldier has to take back control of various realms. The trouble is it's just so long. Each stage in this game seems to be as long as hell, perhaps more than half of the original game. And there's 15 stages. This is at least a 2-hour game, which is way too friggin' long. One of the better things about Altered Beast was that it was, crucially, short. This isn't. And when all you're doing is just punching and kicking on a scrolling stage, it gets tedious before you reach the end of the first level, honestly. Like, this would probably be too much even for Matthew Sweet. And I'm really not a fan of how this pre-rendered and digitised stuff looks on the GBA at all. And with no memorable music to speak of either, there's hardly any of the original's charm. It's certainly not a terrible game, it is honestly better than I expected, but it's a very mediocre one. Well, except for this, the end of level 2 boss. Which sure is something. So, I can absolutely categorically say that Altered Beast Guardian of the Realms for the Game Boy Advance is the best game ever made where you fight a gigantic deformed penis. Probably. Anyway, 10 out of 10, go buy it. And lastly, of course, there is the actual big attempt at a full Altered Beast revival. Project Altered Beast for the PS2 in 2005, which brings the beast into a 3D world. It wasn't worked on by just anybody either. The project was headed up by Makoto Uchida, with Reiko Kodama also involved. Long-time and highly successful Sega folks. It's very easy to assume that 3D remakes like this are always worked on by Western studios or whatever, usually of low birth. But no. Project Altered Beast had the original creators of the game leading it. Which makes you wonder just how they managed to screw it up so badly. Lack of belief? The project becoming a mess during the great Sega restructuring of 2004? Who knows, but Project Altered Beast is an absolute dog of a game. Project Altered Beast has you play as Luke Cutler, a human-come experiment who's part of some sort of genome project or whatever. The chopper carrying you crashes into a mysterious land, and you have to fight various monsters. Fighting them in human form is fairly useless, but Cutler can transform into various beasts at will, including most of your Altered Beast favourites, although I only ever got as far as the werewolf. When you transform, you get a neat video. Well, neat for the first 3 times anyway. When you're a beast, you constantly have to keep killing. There's a green bar that forever needs to be refilled, and if it's running on empty then you start to lose life. Which means you'll be seeing those videos a lot as you switch constantly. It is an okay concept, and it would have worked if the game was any good technically. But holy hell is it not. The camera is one of the worst I've ever experienced in a 3D game, almost always attracted to places where you can't see a bloody thing. There's no lock-on, which means that the beat-em-up portion of this game is basically hammer square aimlessly in all directions and hopefully hit something. It's even more mindless than the original, completely out of step with the times. I mean, there's the likes of God of War and Ninja Gaiden kicking about for heaven's sake. Why even bother with this? Anyway, here's a good part. It's called Jump at Birds for 5 minutes. And no, I'm not joking. It's so good that it's repeated again in the next fucking room. Add on everything just being so dark and grey and boring with loads of blood and all the generic vintage 2005 shit you could eat, and you really do have a piss poor game, with boring levels, overlong and lousy boss fights, and miserable controls. It's so frustrating. With a bit of technical nous, it could have been really good. It is a decent concept, but it's ruined by terrible execution. Now some say that Project Altered Beast may actually have formed the basis for the much hated Werehog stages in Sonic Unleashed. I've never bothered to play that game, but although they do look similar, they honestly look a lot better than this woeful game. Anyway, if you desperately want this game in English, it's gonna have to be PAL. The game was released in Europe and Japan, but after terrible receptions in both regions, the game never saw the light of day in the US. It's games like this that make me glad IPs like my beloved Streets of Rage managed to stay dead. Let's not forget, this wasn't made by some low-rent bunch of Americans or whatever. This was made by Sega. In fact, it was made by the exact same folks who created the original Altered Beast. Okay, not the biggest recommendation, but still. I've often talked about the fall of what was once the most glorious games company of them all, their Simpsons-esque decline into what I would call zombie Sega. If you want a game to sum up the downfall that isn't bloody Sonic 2006 again, then look no further than this one. And with that, Altered Beast once again went into a slumber. This time pretty much for good, aside from another later handheld port for the 3DS as part of Sega's 3D Classics range. There are a couple of other funny things to cover though. What about this? It's Altered Benjamin, a Flash game from the late 2000s. But not just any Flash game, a Flash game based on Altered Beast that's officially endorsed by the cruddy metal band Breakin' Benjamin. How cool is that? Altered Beast's musical legacy is so diverse that Ken Burns himself could do a documentary on it. What more do you need to say other than Matthew Sweet and Breakin' Benjamin? In all seriousness, it may not have been the most popular title, but some of Altered Beast has entered the popular consciousness. The meme Beast Mode is undoubtedly derived from Altered Beast. The various speech samples,
Rise from your grave, power up,
Welcome to your doom.
never give up.
are all pretty well known. Even if there's not a great deal of good about Altered Beast, there's certainly a lot that's memorable and a lot of notoriety. In pure corny mode 3.5 years ago while listening to way too much specials, I said that Altered Beast was the dawning of a new era. Which obviously it wasn't. It was at best a gatekeeper. The first game that a lot of people played on the Mega Drive, one that would hopefully lead people towards other, better games. Never forget kids, the first one's free. Altered Beast is at its best in a pub, not playing but sitting down, having booze and reminiscing, just like all the characters in the ending. A drunken playthrough afterwards might be a little underwhelming, but hey, no matter. Just as the morning after welcomes you to your doom, Altered Beast will always be somewhat well known, a part of gaming consciousness forever. And that is quite the overachievement. Bye for now. Thanks again for watching this video on the almighty Altered Beast. If you like this video, please consider subscribing, and you can also consider following me on my Facebook and Twitter, and supporting me on Patreon. Okay, let's get down to business, the good old thank yous part. So, in Sinson mode, we have Taylor Almond Martin Pataki, Gerard Morris, Lee Norris, Griffin Blackpool. Thank you so much for awesome support to those 5 people. And I also have the following to thank: Mark Johnson, Mark Johnston, Tim Lintz, Robert Kelly, Mike Siegler, Mike Spooner, Edge Reader, Russell Hugo, Scott Coulter, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mitten, Nicole Ketchum, Mark Brooks, Ninth Demon, Peter Sidorn, Ludwig Holmstrom, John Ezell, Kit Leary, Elle O'Brien, Dave Parkinson, and Olaf Olbein. Thank you so much for awesome support, as per usual. I am not entirely sure what is coming up next. There will not be a video next week, but there will, on the bank holiday, be a live stream. So that's why I'm not sure of what's coming up next, and there will definitely be a live stream, most likely on Twitch. Anyway, thanks very much once again for watching this video, and as ever, I shall leave you with, wherever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.